mean the seller just terminated my contract? I have a contract with the seller to buy that house. It is contingent upon me selling my current home, and I didn't sell it by when I initially thought I could, but I know I can sell it before the closing date of my contract with the seller. How can the seller terminate? Hi, everybody. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors and director of the Real Estate Academy of America, here to talk about the sale or lease contingency in a purchase and sale agreement, and to remind everybody to read your contracts. So, today's topic is, as I mentioned, the sale or lease contingency. So generally speaking, a buyer can write a contract and go binding with the seller to buy a new home. And that contract for the purchase of the new home is completely contingent. The buyer has a house they have to sell first. The house they live in now, they want to sell this, buy a new home. Seller accepts a contract knowing or subject to or contingent to buyer selling the current home they live in now. On the exhibit, there is a date that the buyer and the seller negotiate through that the buyer must sell their current home. And the seller and the buyer and the seller with this provision may also negotiate through what we call a kickout, meaning this isn't always the case, but the buyer and the seller in the exhibit that outlines all the terms of this contingency, the buyer's purchase of new home contingent upon, subject to the buyer selling their current home by a specific date. That's where we are right now. Now, through this negotiations, the seller can say, look, I will take your contract. I'll go under contract with you. I will sell you my home. I understand that you have a current home you have to sell. You have to sell it by a certain date. That date can coincide with the closing of the new home, or that can be a date prior to that. Again, that gets negotiated on the exhibit. Additionally, the buyer and the seller may negotiate, and the seller can say, look, I'll give you the opportunity to sell your current home before having to close on mine. But in turn, you give me the opportunity to continue to offer my house for sale. And should I find another buyer that I want to go under contract with, then I can, what we call it is the kickout provision. I can come to you and say, look, I have buyer number 2 that I want to sell my house to, but I am under contract with you. So I will honor our contract provided that you remove certain contingencies or all contingencies, provided that you remove the contingency that your current home has to sell, due diligence contingency, financing contingency, appraisal contingency. You can negotiate through those contingencies. If buyer number 1 says yes, that means the contract buyer number 1 has to purchase new home is not contingent upon anything. Even if the appraisal comes in low, even if the buyer gets turned down for financing, even if the buyer does not sell their current home, they are obligated to still close if the seller exercises this kickout and the buyer accepts it. The buyer is obligated to close on the new home. If they fail to close on the new home, they will be in default of the contract and lose their earnest money. Or seller gets offer from buyer number 2 or finds buyer number 2 they want to sell the house to. They come to buyer number 1 and they say, I've got a binding contract with you. However, in order for us to continue with this contract, you have to remove all contingencies. You have to remove, it's no longer contingent upon you selling your current home, no longer contingent upon the other contingencies negotiated between the buyer and the seller. If the buyer says, I can't do that, I just financially cannot qualify for the new home with a payment on my current home, and I'm not going to take the risk that my current home might not sell, or financing or appraisal or whatever. So the buyer says, thank you so much, seller. I can't go through with that contract without that protection of my earnest money. So the buyer would terminate. They do get their earnest money back because the seller agreed to that contingency. What the seller gets is they are no longer under contract with buyer number one, and the seller now goes under contract with buyer number two and goes to closing. Now, parenthetically, you listing agents, before you ever kick out buyer number one in favor of buyer number two, I've done plenty of videos on this. You fully negotiate the contract with buyer number two, include the backup contingency exhibit, and then you go and exercise the kick out with buyer number one. Why? Well, if you kick out buyer number one and they terminate the contract because they can't, they need those contingencies for protection of earnest money, and then you go back to buyer number two and don't get anything worked out, you're back at square one. So that's the scenario where we are now. You agents need to look at the contracts under which you are binding for the terms of termination of contract. What do I mean? Well, the Georgia Association of Realtors sale or lease contingency exhibit has a provision that should the buyer not sell, not close on their current home by that date negotiated between the buyer and the seller, the contract for the new home automatically terminates. Now, buyer would get their earnest money, but the contract automatically terminates and the seller is back active. However, that is just a contract provision with the Georgia Association of Realtors contracts, with that exhibit on those forms. If the parties are binding on another contract form, let's say the RE form contract package, there is a sale or lease contingency exhibit with the kickout provision, but there is a mention of an automatic termination, but it is not tied in to the time frame of the contingency. The contingency is a contractual contingency that would go through closing. So be careful, you listing agents. Do not send a termination of release agreement. Well, let's look at the forms. So I'm going to share my screen and we will go over these two separate forms. So the first form to look at is the sale or lease contingency exhibit in the Georgia Association of Realtors contract package. And it is F601, sale or lease of buyer's property contingency exhibit. And I'm not going to cover the whole thing, but basically this is the offer date, because it goes with an offer. Property known, this is the new home the buyer is going to buy. It is contingent. The buyer does have a current home that the buyer needs to sell. And then you disclose, is it currently listed? Is it currently under contract? So forth and so on. Then this paragraph number 3, again, this is the GAR exhibit. This agreement is contingent upon the occurrence of the following on or before either the closing date for the closing of the new home, or you fill in a closing date if it's not the closing date. This is the contingency period. Paragraph 4 in the Georgia Association of Realtors exhibit says, in the event the contingency period ends without, in my example, the buyer selling and closing on their current home. Again, this is the contingency period, so y'all don't leave this blank. It either coincides with the closing or a date that precedes the closing. if that date comes and goes and the buyer has not closed on their house, then the agreement for the new home, this whole contract, shall terminate at that time. And then the buyer will get their earnest money back, and the seller is back active and free to sell to another buyer, so forth and so on. There's a lot more in this exhibit, so forth and so on. It additionally talks about a kickout. So also in the GAR exhibit is a kickout that basically says, if the seller gets an offer from another buyer that they want to accept, they come back to buyer number one, this buyer, and can kick out either all contingencies, meaning the buyer has to, what gets kicked out of the contract is either all contingencies or the sale or lease contingency, due diligence, financing, so forth and so on. And as described earlier, if the seller comes back to buyer number one, says, I've got another offer, but I'm under contract with you, I'll continue with you, but these contingencies are kicked out of the contract. If the buyer says yes, they go on to closing, and the buyer is obligated to close for any or no reason, other than FHA appraisal. That's a whole nother topic. If the buyer says, no, I need to protect my earnest money, I can't close without this protection, then that, so forth and so on. But the biggest thing is this contingency time frame and termination. Now, let's look at the exhibit from the RE forms contract package, and a lot of agents refer to this as the FMLS contract package. Sale or lease contingency exhibit, and this is form RE 251 in the RE forms package. This same thing, the contract buyer has on the new home is contingent upon the buyer selling or leasing their current property located here. This contingency shall expire at 11:59 on so many days after the binding agreement date. And then there is a kickout provision as I've described. Now, there is nothing about termination tied to the contingency time frame. It's just like any contingency time frame. If we have, well, let me go through here and see. Back to the kickout. The kickout says the seller does have if the seller has the right to demand the buyer remove all contingencies during the contingency time frame, seller shall continue to market the property. Should seller receive an offer from a buyer, then seller shall notify buyer, and they have so many hours after receiving notice to either remove all contingencies or not. If the buyer fails to deliver an amendment to the seller, removing all the contingencies, then the contract for the new home is automatically terminated and earnest money goes back to the buyer. So in the RE forms exhibit, the automatic termination of the contract for the new home is only tied in to the seller kicking out the buyer for another buyer. It is not tied into the time frame of the contingency period itself, which is this up here. This time frame for this contingency acts like any other time frame for any other contingency. For example, let's say we had 21 days here. So similarly to, let's say there's a 21-day financing contingency. It is now day 22 in a financing contingency. Buyer didn't terminate. Buyer is obligated to close. The contract doesn't terminate. The buyer's obligated to close. If for whatever reason they don't get their loan and they terminate, their earnest money is at risk. They will lose their earnest money because they only had so many days to terminate based on that contingency and protect their earnest money. Same thing here. They only, let's say this is 21 days. they only had 21 days to sell their current home, they only had 21 days in my example to terminate the contract with the seller and protect their earnest money should they not have sold their current home. However, if they don't sell their current home within this 21 days, they're still under contract with the seller. They still have through closing date to close on this house by whatever means they can. If they don't sell their house after the 21 days in my example and before closing, for any reason, including if they didn't sell their current home, they would just lose their earnest money because that contingency time frame for protection of earnest money is passed. But again, the contract itself does not automatically terminate when the parties are binding using this RE forms exhibit. The termination is not tied into the contingency time frame period itself, just to a kickout. So, bottom line, everybody needs to read the contracts and not just assume you know all about a specific contingency just because you see a sale or lease contingency exhibit. There are various provisions. There are some provisions that do pertain to Georgia law and contract law, but there are many, many, many contract provisions that are very specific to the contract under which the buyer and seller are binding. That's one example. Thank you guys so much for watching. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.